He gave away his worst land as a joke, but 3 years later he regretted it. Silas Miller had a way of smiling that everyone in the region knew. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was that slow, corner-of-the-mouth smile he used when he thought he was getting the better of someone. And on that September afternoon, he was smiling like that a lot. The document was signed. The young man had accepted. And that's when the story started taking a turn Silas didn't expect. Because what seemed like the biggest victory of his life was in fact the beginning of something that would turn everything upside down. And look, it wasn't quick. It took 3 years. 3 long years, full of things Silas swore he'd never admit out loud. But life has a way of collecting what you owe. Silas had reached his 67th year as a man who had built everything with his own hands. Son of a farmer, he started with nothing but a hoe and a stubbornness his mother called a gift and his father called a curse. Over 4 decades he kept adding land. Good land, bad land, thick brush land nobody wanted. He bought whatever came along and transformed what he could. He had a face weathered by many summers, a grey mustache he never let grow too long, and a worn-out straw hat he'd had since his oldest son was still crawling. But there was one lot, about 5 miles from the main ranch house, that he had never been able to make work. Dry, rocky, far from any spring. Every time it rained there, the water ran down the slope without soaking into the soil. He had tried soybeans, tried pasture, tried everything. The land wouldn't cooperate. It became a joke among the neighbors. They called it Silas's Cemetery, because it was the only place he couldn't grow anything, and everyone knew it ate at him inside. Jacob Henderson was 29 years old and was the son of Sarah Henderson, a woman with white hair and calloused hands who had been washing clothes for half the families in that region since before Jacob was born. The young man had come back from the state capital, where he had tried to make a life for 4 years without success. He came back empty-handed, with a worn-out backpack and a battered little notebook full of notes that no one in the region understood. It was Mrs. Martha, Silas's wife, who brought up the subject at the table one Sunday afternoon. "Sarah asked me if you had any land to rent to Jacob. The boy wants to try planting something." Silas looked up from his plate and paused for a second. Then he let out that smile. "Plant where? Does he have money to rent?" "He has almost nothing. That's why she asked." Silas was quiet for a while. He chewed slowly, and then the idea came. An idea that, in his head, was perfect. He wasn't going to rent. He was going to give. He was going to give the impossible lot to Jacob for free for 3 years. He'd let the young man try. He'd let him beat his head against that land that yielded nothing. It would be a way to prove that piece of ground was truly hopeless and still come out looking like the generous man who gave a chance. The following week, he called Jacob. "Look, son, I heard you want to work the land. I have a lot I'm not using. I'll give it to you to work for 3 years. No charge." Jacob looked at him with a seriousness Silas didn't expect on such a young face. "Which lot is that?" "Stony Hollow." There was a silence. In the room, Silas's oldest son, Caleb, who was leaning against the wall, let out a short laugh that he tried to hide with a cough. Everyone in the region knew what the Stony Hollow lot was. Jacob didn't smile. He just asked, "Can I see the document before I sign?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Silas didn't expect that. "I was expecting either a shameless no or a relieved yes, too quick to think. I wasn't expecting someone asking to read the paper calmly. But I brought the document, and Jacob read it, word by word, line by line. He handed the paper back without rushing. "All right, I accept." Silas left that conversation convinced he had made an excellent deal. Caleb spent the week telling his friends, "Jacob took Stony Hollow. This is going to be funny to watch." And people laughed, because everyone knew. Martha, who had been listening from a distance, said nothing at the time. But that night, when they were already lying in bed with the lights off, she spoke softly. "Silas, do you think it was right?" "What was right?" "Giving him that land knowing it's worthless. You didn't give it because you want to help. You gave it to watch the boy fail." Silas didn't answer. He stared at the ceiling in the dark for a long while. Then he turned over and closed his eyes. The first few months were exactly what Silas had expected. Jacob showed up at Stony Hollow every morning, leaving home before sunrise, coming back when the heat was already strong, with his hands covered in red dirt and his shirt soaked through. He had no machines. He had a hoe, an old wheelbarrow, and that worn-out notebook. People passing by the road near the lot would watch from a distance and not understand what the young man was doing. He dug in strange places. He put branches, dry leaves, and leftover grass into a deep trench, covered it with dirt, dug somewhere else again. Sarah started selling more homemade treats and preserves at the market on weekends to help her son buy supplies. She didn't complain to anyone, but those who knew her well could see in her expression that she was worried. Silas would drive by the road every now and then, on purpose. He'd look, shake his head slowly with his usual smile. Caleb asked one day, "Dad, is Jacob still out at Stony Hollow?" "Every day." "But what is he planting?" "Nothing yet, just keeps turning the soil." "He'll give up." Silas neither said yes nor no, but he thought so. Winter passed. Stony Hollow still looked dry to anyone looking from the outside, but those who walked nearby noticed the smell of the soil had changed. The earth in some spots had gotten darker, staying moist longer, and Jacob had started hauling water in an old tank truck he rented with the money his mother had saved. Every day, without fail. Martha went to visit Sarah one afternoon and came back quiet. "Jacob is working on a technique to capture rainwater," she told Silas, while folding cloths in the kitchen. "He spent 4 years studying that up in the state capital. He says that land has more potential than it seems." Silas snorted. "Potential? Sarah is letting her son waste her money on a pipe dream." Sarah said it was his idea, and that she believes in it. Silas didn't answer, but that night he slept poorly, with a discomfort he couldn't quite name. The second year came, and things at Stony Hollow began to change in a way Silas couldn't ignore. Jacob had built, with cheap lumber and a lot of hard work, a system of gutters along the slopes of the property that channeled rainwater into cisterns he had dug himself with a shovel. It looked like the work of a madman at first glance, but the cisterns filled with the first rains of October, and for the first time in decades that land stayed moist for weeks after each rain. Then the young man planted tomatoes, rows and rows of tomatoes, with precise spacing in raised beds he had learned to make from that little notebook. The dark, damp soil of the beds looked like something else. It seemed to have come alive. Silas went there in person to see. He didn't want to admit that to anyone, but he went. He parked the car far from the entrance and walked to the fence. He stood there looking for a long time, alone, with his hat on and his hands in his pockets. The seedlings were sprouting. He left without saying a word to anyone. Look, I keep thinking about what went through Silas's mind at that moment, because we've all felt that at some point in life, haven't we? That feeling of seeing someone make something work that you swore wouldn't. It's uncomfortable. It's more than that. It's a mirror you didn't ask to look into, but it's there. In the following months, the story of Stony Hollow began to spread through the region. People who used to laugh at Jacob now stopped to peer through the gaps in the fence as they passed by car or on foot. The tomato plants had grown strong, red, in rows that seemed endless, stretching as far as the eye could see under the open sky. The young man had managed to bring life to a place everyone had given up on. Caleb went to see for himself and came back sheepish. "Dad," he said, leaning against the porch door, "Stony Hollow looks different." Silas was sitting with his hat on, looking at the horizon. "I know. I can't understand how he did it. Neither can I." There was a long silence between the two, and that's when the complication Silas hadn't expected arrived. A merchant from a neighboring town had heard about the Stony Hollow tomatoes and had gone to Jacob with an offer. A big offer. He wanted to buy the entire production for 3 consecutive seasons with an advance because the quality was exceptional. Jacob had said he needed to think, that he would talk to his mother, but that he was inclined to close the deal. Who brought this news to Silas was Martha, who had heard it from Sarah. Silas was too quiet after that. Quiet in a way that Martha knew well, and that was never peace. It was a churning inside. The following night, he came to her with a folded paper in his hand. "The contract I signed with Jacob was for 3 years. The 3rd year starts in 2 months. Martha looked at the paper. "So what, Silas?" "So at the end of the 3rd year, the land comes back to me." She stood still. "Silas, the land is mine." "The land is yours, yes. But what he built on it, will that also be yours?" "Whatever is on my land is mine." Martha slowly closed her eyes, opened them again. "I can't believe you're thinking about that." "I'm not thinking, I'm reading what's written. You gave that land to make fun of the boy. Everyone knows that. Even you know that. And now that he made it work, you want to take it back?" Silas folded the paper and went to the bedroom without answering. In the days that followed, he lived with that weight in his chest. He knew Martha was right. He knew. But his stubbornness was too great, and his wounded pride was even bigger. He had been wrong to give that land for the wrong reason, and now the mistake was growing in front of him like a red tomato plant he hadn't planted. Caleb, thinking he was helping his father, went to Jacob on his own. I don't know exactly everything that was said in that conversation, but Jacob told his mother and Sarah told Martha, and Martha sat with it for a few days before deciding what to do. What Caleb said to Jacob was basically this: that the contract ended in 2 months, that the land belonged to his father, and that it would be best for the young man to start thinking about another path. Jacob listened to everything without interrupting. In the end, he said only one thing: "I'm going to talk to your father." Caleb didn't expect that. "You don't need to talk to him. I'm already telling you how it is. With all due respect, Caleb, the agreement was with your father. I want to speak with him." 2 days later, Jacob showed up at the main ranch house, hat in hand, pressed shirt, with that serious manner he had from the start. Silas was on the porch when he saw the young man's figure coming down the dirt road. They sat down facing each other at an old wooden table in the shade of a mango tree at the back of the yard. Jacob spoke first. "Mr. Silas, you gave me that land knowing it was no good. I know that. You know I know. No need to pretend it was kindness." Silas stayed quiet. "But I took it anyway, because I needed a chance. And I had no money to buy anything, no rich relative to help me." "You made it work," Silas said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "I did, with a lot of work. With the money my mother saved up washing other people's clothes for years. With things I learned that folks around here called book nonsense." Silas looked at the ground. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," Jacob went on. "I came to talk man to man. You have the right to take the land back. The paper says so. But I needed to look you in the eye and find out if that's what's going to happen." And then something happened that nobody around expected. Silas looked up, and his eyes were wet. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us folks who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That 67-year-old man, who had built everything through sheer grit, who had never apologized to anyone in his life, opened his mouth and stayed a long while without being able to say anything. When his voice came back, it was different, without the smirk, without the stubbornness tangled up in his words. "Jacob," he said, "I was petty with you." The young man didn't blink. "I gave you that land so you'd fail. I wanted you to fail, because you were young and bold and I'm old and proud, and I needed someone to fail where I had already failed before." He paused, swallowed. "But you didn't fail." A heavy silence between them. "I can't undo what I thought, but I can do things differently now." Silas went into the house and came back with a paper. It was a new document, written in his own hand that very morning before Jacob even arrived, as if he already knew this conversation was bound to happen sooner or later. He renewed the use of the land for another 5 years, at no cost, with one condition, that Jacob teach him what he had learned and done on that plot. Jacob read the paper, read it twice slowly. "Why do you want to learn?" he asked. "Because I have 70 acres poorly used, and because I was foolish enough to think I already knew everything I needed to know." I had to pause for a second before continuing this part. "Because there's something very beautiful in it. A man nearly 70 years old asking to learn from a 29-year-old. For someone who spent his whole life being the authority, being the learner, hurts in a deep place. And he did it anyway. In the following days, Silas went for the first time to Stony Hollow with Jacob. The young man showed him everything: the cisterns, the wooden gutters, the raised beds, the way to compost with what was left over from the land itself, the spacing between rows calculated to catch the afternoon sun. Silas walked slowly, straw hat on his head and worn leather vest, hands in his pockets, listening without interrupting. At one point, he stopped in the middle of a row of tomato plants and stood looking at them from one end to the other, mouth open, eyes wide, like someone seeing something that simply doesn't fit within what they believed was possible. It was the expression of someone who understands, in that moment, that the world is bigger than the reach of their own knowledge. Sarah found out about the contract renewal that same day, through Martha. The two women sat in the kitchen facing each other, with a cup of coffee each cooling on the table. "Martha," Sarah said slowly, "did you know he was going to do that?" Martha gave a small smile. "I expected it. Silas is too stubborn. But he's not mean. Never was." "You waited a long time for someone who's not mean." "I did. But it was worth it." Sarah looked out the window. Outside, the yard had a lemon tree heavy with fruit. "My son is going to be happy here." "And Silas is going to be a better man than he was," Martha said. "He already is, ever since he got up from that table with the paper in his hand." Caleb took a while to understand what had happened. He didn't like it at first. He thought his father had given in too much, that they had taken advantage of him. But one night when father and son were sitting on the porch looking into the dark, Silas said something that stuck. "Caleb, the difference between an old man who grew and one who just got old is knowing how to recognize when he was wrong and what to do about it after." Caleb stared at his father as if seeing him for the first time in many years. "I was wrong with Jacob, but I still managed to make it right. And you can see how it's going." The following summer, Silas decided to use the techniques he had learned on a damp valley of the farm that had been poorly used for years. He called Jacob to help plan. The two spent a whole week measuring, drawing on paper, discussing what they would plant. Sometimes they argued. Silas still had that stubborn way of defending what he thought, but now he also listened. And when he truly listened, things took a better turn. Martha watched them work together from the kitchen window. She would stand there watching without either of them noticing, with that smile of someone who had waited a long time for something, and finally saw it happen. By the end of the third year, with the harvest already established and the new agreement in effect, Jacob went to the county clerk's office to formalize a production partnership between him and Silas. It was no longer just land use. It was a working partnership, with profit and responsibility sharing, signed by two men who had started from a place of mistrust and arrived at a place of respect. Silas signed with a hand that already trembled a little from the years, but the handwriting came out steady. Outside the county clerk's office, the sun was beating down. The two stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Silas extended his hand. Jacob shook it. "Thank you for the chance, Mr. Silas." Silas gave a smile, not the half-smile everyone knew. Another one, more open, that Martha always said was rare to appear, but when it did, it was the real one. "It wasn't me who gave the chance," he said. "You went and took it." They stood like that for a moment, hands clasped, the afternoon sun over the tomato field visible in the distance, red and vast and impossible like everything that once seemed impossible and one day stopped being. And Silas Miller, who had spent his whole life thinking he knew everything, understood at that moment that he was beginning to learn again, and that this, at 67 years old, was the rarest gift life could give. End of story. There are things that life teaches in a way that no words can quite capture. Silas needed a tomato field and a young man with a little notebook to understand that too much pride closes the doors we most need to open, and the most beautiful thing of all is that he was still able to open them. That's no small thing. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments, we love to know. And you, do you think Silas made the right choice in the end? Leave your opinion down below, in your own words. Thank you very much for keeping us company until now. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.